My name is Tony Humphreys. I'm a pharmacist by training, background, and coming out of Ireland originally, but working for many years with the European Medicines Agency, currently in London, yeah, but not much longer, yeah. I have to start with a thank you and two apologies, and the first thank you is of course to Professor Jean-Hugues Trouvan, who is a very old colleague of mine, and I'm very proud to say that, who gave me this kind invitation together with the faculty to address you here today in this very venerable institution. And when I came to the address and I saw it was a museum of medicine, I really thought I ended up in the wrong location, but it's very good that it is a living museum of medicine, yeah? So the two apologies, yeah? The first apologies is anglais. Trust me, you may struggle to follow me in English, but if I try to present in French, it would be a catastrophe. I really would, so apologies for that. It's not that I wouldn't. I love the language, but I struggle, yeah, in constant lutte. The second apology is I will give a talk that's the application of regulatory science within the European Medicines Regulatory Network. And that is only one perspective on this big thing we call regulatory science. And as the previous speaker was saying, that there's a wider context, and in fact it's all about our duty to public health, civil society, whatever. And therefore that perspective is from somebody within that network, and obviously is limited because of that. But having said that, it's my personal take on it, because it's quite a complex topic. It's very broad-ranging. And just to clarify what I mean by the European Medicines Regulatory Network is the combination of the European Medicines Agency together with all of the other national drug agencies, pharmaceutical agencies, ANSM in France, for example, MHRA in the UK, all those national agencies which collectively form what we call the Medicines Regulatory Network. But the other limitation of this perspective is it's only about pharmaceuticals, and we all know that drugs are only part of the health delivery problem, and you mentioned surgery and all sorts of other sort of social interventions, and always remember that this sort of drug perspective is certainly limited and has got some boundaries associated with it. But having said that, I'm very happy to proceed, and let's hope you do find it of somewhat relevance to you. In terms of what is regulatory science, this is the definition that the network applies in our pharmaceutical context. And I think you have an FDA speaker later on today in the program. They have a slightly different definition, similar but different, yeah. But what it is this range of scientific disciplines that are applied to the quality, safety, and efficacy assessment of medicinal products, and that inform the regulatory decision-making throughout the life cycle of a medicine. And that's very important. It's not a point in time. There is no such thing as a magic moment that we know everything about a drug product. It's something that is almost like a life journey along with the product in terms of how we accumulate that knowledge. So there is no one unique time that a drug is known to be safe and effective, and no other that is unsafe and effective. It is this sort of continuum, and that's part of the challenge. But it does encompass basic and applied medicinal science and social sciences, and contributes to the development of regulatory standards and tools. So this is, I believe, what all this interdisciplinary approach will bring to the table, and it's this sort of, this is the definition certainly that's currently active in the Medicines Regulatory Network. But the important point about why are we talking about it at all is that middle bit, informing the regulatory decision making, at least from the perspective of a pharmaceutical regulator. Okay. Now, this famous network that I was telling you about have managed to get their act together and come out with a strategy to 2020. And you might think that's normal. Everybody's got a strategy, every business, every operation. Actually, this is the first time that Europe as a network has such a strategy. It came around 2015, 5-year strategy. We're in the middle of implementing it. So it's an achievement in itself. So what does this strategy, which are normally very dry documents, what does it say about regulatory science? It says that we have to ensure that we have the capability to regulate novel products of the future, that we have to develop this regulatory science, the definition we had before. We have to consider greater use of real-world databases, and this takes us beyond the classical dependence on the randomized controlled trials generated primarily by the industry. And we also have to increase the transparency about the data that underpin the regulatory decisions, because we know that the regulators are not a monopolist in terms of having the divine right of judgment on any situation. Okay, so that's what I'm hoping to cover over the next half an hour or so. The capability to regulate novel products of the future, and this is the unknown unknowns in a sense. So what have we done about that? What the strategy says is, of course, there's rapid advances in science. We all know the promise, but also the challenge within the personalized medicines type area. We have to accept that traditional methods of assessment and surveillance cannot necessarily be applied to these innovative products. I mean, if we're honest, some of the assessment traditions we've had in Europe are based on the post-thalidomide reactions in the 60s and the 70s, and you could say, how well have we evolved our system and our standards since then, you know? Some very venerable people go almost as far as that in terms of the 70s and the 80s in terms of when they started their practice. And we'll also have to ensure, the network will have to ensure that it understands these new and upcoming technologies. And this is an important point. Although regulators are on a critical path in the development cycle, they're not in control of the innovation. The innovation is out there. It's the industry, it's the academia, it's all those geniuses in the university hospitals, whatever, at the cutting edge, coming up with the great ideas to overcome the problems. And that isn't a European thing, that isn't even a US-Europe, it's a global thing these days. And that's part of the challenge. And if you think of all the developments in the Far East and places like that, it really is hard to get your head around all of this emerging innovation and have a true impact assessment of it. So what's been our response? Okay, very good. This is, I'm not too sure how this transition is going to work. Okay, we're into outer space, you know, and I haven't lost the plots, I assure you. The idea here is that we want to observe what is coming down the line or over the horizon in a sense. And you can't really do that from a sort of static location. So the image here is that, you know, a sort of satellite going around on the globe trying to see what's out there, basically. And the first satellite we have is pretty much from the agency's perspective. Don't worry too much about the acronyms, IMI office, which is, I'll talk about later, product lifecycle, ITF business pipeline. Suffice to say is a lot of industry knock on our door in the agency and say, we have these products in our pipeline or we're developing these products, but it's so unusual we don't really know how to navigate the regulatory pathway. So to some extent, that's one source of information that we know what's coming down the line. And it also is a signal to us as regulators we may have to adapt our standards and our practices, okay? The second one then, of course, is industry itself, but also academia, and increasingly academia. If you look at the source of innovation around Europe and the world, it's not the big pharma, because sometimes they become too big to succeed. It's actually, the innovation is happening in the academic institution, the university hospitals, and various small spin-off companies, etc. And we need to have the dialogue with those guys to know what's coming, because otherwise we have a regulatory system not fit for purpose, okay? We also have our commission colleagues, and they're very important, not just obviously from the public health with Sante, the enterprise guys with the GROW, but also the DG research, because of all the billions that they pump in and in setting the research agenda in terms of, at least from the European perspective, as to what are they funding. And there has to be an interplay between what's happening in the academic environment, spin-out environment, and what those research questions being framed by the Commission should be. And then finally, we obviously have the operation of the wider network itself at the national agency level, and importantly, our contact with the international regulators, because they have largely the same perspective. The FDA will be up there in the top left-hand side. They'll be dealing with US-based institutions, industry, etc. They'll have an equivalent of their health departments, you know, the political level, and obviously they have outreach across the world as well. I just want to take one time just to highlight one little box up there. It's the top left one, the EU Innovation Network, because this is a brand new concept we came up with only a couple of years ago, and it's a very simple idea.
It's essentially saying that across Europe, at most of the member state levels, they've essentially set up an innovation office. And this has only happened in the last couple of years. And it's been coordinated at the agency, and it's been co-chaired by a gentleman from the Finnish agency, and also one of my colleagues who works at the European Medicines Agency. And all of these various innovation offices at the local regulatory agencies are all trying to do the same thing. They want to, if you look to the right, strengthen support to the innovators in the early development of medicines. And one of the ideas behind this is that, of course, even the language barrier. We've talked to companies for 20 years in London, but it's largely an English conversation. It's a lot easier if you're in a local level institution to have that conversation at the local level with your local regulatory authority, particularly as you're doing your preclinical studies and your first-in-man studies, and recognizing that clinical trials are regulated nationally across Europe. And that dialogue is considered, very useful, almost signposting and guiding those early companies on how they should take their early steps in the development. And at a degree of maturity, they're then signposted on to more centralized regulatory contact at the European Medicines Agency, etc. So the idea is really to foster those developments at the local level. It's all very easy to put up this chain and say everything is perfect and they provide a wonderful service. This is in its infancy, it's baby steps, and the degree of investment is very modest, but there is at least a statement of ambition. But it's fair to say that some member states are in a better position to have invested in this than others, and that's the usual story in Europe. But at least it's it's the most recent attempt we've had now at outreach into the local area in terms of fostering innovation. Okay, the last point on that is innovation horizon scanning. Brings us back to that image of the satellites, etc. What we're particularly interested in doing in this, because everybody's doing horizon scanning. Most national public health authorities are doing horizon scanning to see what's going to affect their health budgets down the line. How do we make room for the next, greatest innovation that's about to hit in whatever therapeutic area? And that's very important discussion. But from our perspective, it's also learning to know what sort of products are there and what sort of regulatory challenges or adaptations we're going to have to put in place in order to allow these things to go through. And we use a whole source of different informations in a structured horizon scanning manner to try to identify what those products are. And it's a whole load of sources, scientific literature, very obvious, media reports, talking to the investors, because follow the money is a very old adage in terms of if the investors are putting it in, they typically know a hell of a lot about what's likely to be translated into the future, and all sorts of other sources as well. So that's the horizon scanning that's been done. But again, that's this whole idea just to try to understand what's out there or what's likely to hit and when, CAR T cells, whatever you might want to think is the next great thing. So, okay, so once we've done that, we have an idea what's out there. The next ambition that we had in the strategy was to develop regulatory science. So how do you develop regulatory science? Because it's such a broad definition, such a broad topic. So we believe that regulatory science as an approach to how products are developed will become more prominent, and is, by definition. That's why we're here today. And the regulators, this is our network, will need to work more closely with the academic community and expert patient community, industry and others to ensure appropriate support is given to developments in this area. So again, it's saying the regulators are not in the lead. It's for others to lead, but for the regulators to at least engage, understand and translate. And we do see this activity as complementary to the Horizon 2020, again coming from the DD research guys, and also the Innovative Medicines Initiative, both the first and the second one of those, which is literally pumping billions of euros into research topics across Europe. In terms of IMI, I mean, that's just a very simple digest of some of the thematic areas that were covered in IMI 1 and IMI 2. You could spend a whole, lecture or day on any one of those topic areas and beyond. it's sort of, I just wanted to share with you the sort of the magnitude of the challenge that we have as a regulatory system to engage with all of this investment in regulatory science. Yeah? And from our perspective, let's have a look at this in terms of translating what's coming out of something like IMI into the regulatory practice. We have this classical backbone of the life cycle of the development, from the early R&D, preclinical, biomarker development, clinical methods, peri-approval, and what we call post-authorization. That's very bog standard, you know, sort of classical backbone development. In terms of our ability to support any one of these initiatives, the little black triangle is an advisory role. A project member is a little bit more substantial with the red triangle, and then you're either a project or work package leader. You're actually taking responsibility for coordinating, driving, and producing. So of course the commitment, and by implication the resource investment, is so much the greater. So you may not be surprised from the regulator's perspective, we've actually invested more heavily in the post-authorization setting rather than in the very early R&D area, which to some extent, you know, it's nice to be aware of that, but it's something that indeed the industry itself, together with academia, can work out in what we call the pre-competitive space. Yeah? Having said that, there may be that there is a desire, of course, to engage right across that and to try to understand, but with limited resources, the way things have tracked out, certainly since the initial IMI, the system as a network has invested more in that peri-approval, post-authorization setting. And I'll come to that then, you know, a little bit later. Okay, that's a... What else am I going to say? The other thing that we do, and again, it's to do with the introductory speaker as well, with talking to make a research network. One of the things that the agency has done over the years is to work with patients, consumers, and healthcare professionals to essentially have working parties or networks of these, which are typically structured as European agencies or national agencies and groups of those structures at the patient and healthcare level. And then the other one is with the academic learning societies, in particular focusing on networks of pharmacoepidemiology and pharmacovigilance, the so-called NCEP network, and obviously that's all about PE studies. And then very importantly, trying to get as a byproduct of the pediatric regulation, to try to get pediatric research done, knowing that the pediatric regulation said to the industry, you need to do more trials in children. There's no point in telling the industry, beating them with a stick to do more trials, if in Europe we don't have the patients to go into those trials to fulfill the study. So to some extent, you got to free up that capacity, you got to rationalize that capacity to allow those studies to be conducted. So again, we're presenting something to say everything is perfect. No, it's not. There's challenges behind each and every one of these initiatives, but at least it's a response from the network from a problem area. One other thing, I just want, the most recent thing, because this is the thing about regulatory science, you know, we probably wouldn't be having this discussion about 10 years ago. You know, it just wasn't there on our horizon at the time. We were just doing our day job primarily, I think we'd have to be fair to say. It's certainly got a lot of momentum over the last 10 years that I've been associated with the business, and it is increasingly so. And it's not just a European context, it's a global context. Just in March of this year, I wanted to highlight the fact that we've introduced a framework for interaction between the agency and academia. And this wasn't the fact that we never talked to academia up to that point, we have, but this is an attempt to invest into that dialogue in a more structured way and you know, essentially to mobilize the academia to come into our world in a greater way. And I think it's fair to say that, you know, in the academic world, most of their focus is on publications, research, you know, active research and downstream publications. And sometimes the regulatory world seems somewhat removed from that. And in a sense, then we had this bilateral dialogue with the industry. Yes, we're aware of things out there in the scientific publication, as always, as a baseline, but any direct contact with the academics or involvement in our structures, there was always seen as a potential benefit to increase that interaction to a much greater level. So this framework, at very early days, only adopted March of this year, is look at the elements we're trying to do to map the academic entities with an interest in regulatory activities, to evolve the available expertise, because, you know, in some of these challenges, we just don't have that expertise within the network itself, and we're going to have to recruit it in from those academic centers. We also want them to use opportunities to promote research and knowledge generation. And that's also through the interaction with the DG research colleagues and setting those research agendas and saying, guys, you know, based on our experience of regulating pharmaceutical products and all the products we have, problems we may have post-authorization, we would really benefit from research in topic A, topic B, topic C. So that's what we mean by saying, you know, promoting a research agenda. Promote and reinforce dialogue through effective communication and monitoring progress and output of the cooperation. I mean, it's early days, as I say. We have opened up an office to support this interaction, and you can judge us then on the results in years to come, all else being equal. The third element that I want to go on to is, well, in fact, it's the fourth now, if I remember rightly. It's considering the, well, no, it's the third. Consider greater use of real-world evidence, okay? So we've done the sort of awareness of the products that's out there, yeah? We've done the development of the regulatory tools in terms of the regulatory science itself, with the reach out to IMI, academic offices, etc. But there is this feeling or understanding within the system that we could do an awful lot more with so-called real-world evidence that is out there. And we have two sort of aspects to this, one of which is understanding the landscape that we're facing. And this particular slide sort of illustrates part of the problem, because what is real-world evidence? And you can go around, it's a very hot topic, and it's often confused with what we call big data, is another sort of umbrella term for it. And you'll have all sorts of big data workshops going on far beyond the pharmaceutical arena as well, all around Europe and the world. And everyone's getting very excited about sort of entries of Google and Amazon and all of these big players into this sort of area, and are quite nervous maybe about what's going to result as a consequence. But there's no doubt that in our health systems we have a vast amount of real-world evidence. And if you look at the explosion there in the top right, the registries, the claims databases, the surveys, the electronic health records, and we have the whole plethora then of genomic type data that's coming from the new understanding of biology. And I think it's fair to say, as a health system in Europe and elsewhere, that we are have been far more concerned to follow how the money has gone in the health system than to follow how the outcome for the patient has gone, in the sense that we're very concerned about controlling prescriber patterns, pharmacy, dispensing patterns, whatever, and we almost are able to account for each and every cent of what's spent and who spends it and when it's spent. And we have great systems for that. But in terms of what products were used in what patients and how did the patient benefit or not, I think it's fair to say we have a lot of room for improvement. We have plenty of opportunity for catch-up, as the Americans would say. Again, from the regulatory network perspective, our investment in this is, we did a big data workshop there in November 16, and that was really just to understand what is out there. We also focused in on something we're a lot more comfortable with as regulators, because registries, product registries, patient registries, we've worked with them for quite some time, but there's even a lot of room for improvement in that area, as we found from that more recent workshop. And we've set up this joint task force within the network. HMA is just an acronym for the heads of the Medicines Agency, and EMA is the European Medicines Agency. It's just simply saying the network set up a joint task force on this big data. Again, they're trying to map what's out there. It's more trying to understand and what's the opportunities for engagement. I'll skip through the next few slides. It's more just to illustrate the potential, but I don't really want to bog you down in the detail, but I'm happy to come back if you wish in Q&A. As part of this is sort of big data, real-world evidence benefits for the stakeholders. This is what I call the virtuous potential slide, because it's wonderful, isn't it, you know? Improving access to real-world data, reducing cost of development, enabling innovation, optimizing indications, safe medicines, effectiveness. You could go around that. Who could have a problem with any one of those outcomes? It's absolutely wonderful, I can really, you know. But the reality, The reality is limited access. There's a lot of barriers to accessing this information and for making these systems talk to each other. And that's in terms of this task force trying to understand that, we are, certainly within the pharmaceutical arena and from the regulator's perspective, we are not sole owners of this problem, and therefore we cannot provide sole solutions for this problem. It is absolutely a societal level discussion within the European context as to how and why and when and we're going to make this information available. If you ask me for personal view, I'm fully on the position that this should be made available for the benefit of the greater good sort of concept with the right protections in place, but it really is something that in the detail becomes very complex, as we know in Europe only too well. So this sort of fragmentation, lack of interoperability, governance and privacy concerns, etc., it's all there, but that doesn't mean to say just because it's difficult doesn't mean to say we shouldn't have a go at trying to crack it, and in a sense we believe we have a public health imperative to attempt to do so. And the reason being is that on the more positive side of things, we believe that the data can have applications going back to this sort of life cycle in the early development phase, and I won't list all of these, but for example, identification of the target population and stratification based on real-world evidence, a greater understanding of the situation. Extrapolation of adult data pediatrics is a very common challenge that the system is faced with, and in particular the last one there, understanding surrogate endpoints. There's been a huge investment right across the board in surrogate endpoints, biomarkers, etc. When it comes then to the actual approval time point, it's essentially trying to understand drug utilization and understanding the current clinical care practice resource utilization vis-a-vis what product we might be introducing into that environment, and also then developing of the post-marketing plan, the risk management measures to address the unknowns at the licensing point, the design of the so-called post-authorization efficacy studies, in addition to various safety studies, and focusing in at the various at-risk populations, again with reference to the first speaker. And then finally, in the post-authorization phase, and this is maybe something that the system historically hasn't always been very good at doing, quite frankly, assessing the long-term benefit risk. Yeah? And I'll come on to talk about the pharmacovigilance legislation, but in particular the pharmacovigilance committee. And I think in Europe, that piece of legislation and the institution of that committee has been part of our response to try to address and assess that long-term benefit risk. And I mean, I'll highlight that one there, but of course we also have, you know, off-label uses in children in terms of, and indeed in adults for that example, leading to various label expansions. And we also have to look at comparative effectiveness in terms of knowing that there are very strong restrictions in the initial authorization phase where you only have comparative data against, say, one product, and we all know that with a multiplicity of products out there, the performance of the drug in the real world can be rather different to that seen in the clinical trial. So that's the sort of the potential of all this data, and it's something then that the system believes it can't ignore. We have to get on board with it, try to understand it, and attempt to react to it. Okay, the second part of this greater use of the real world evidence is the PRAC as a frontline for real use cases. Yeah, and this is to some extent it's not by accident that when we look at the IMI that those post-authorization peri-approval projects were the most actively invested in by the network system, and that's simply because the use of alternative sources of data has been greatest by the Pharmacovigilance Committee. So just for those colleagues not aware, the PRAC is this Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee. It was instituted in 2012 now, so it's still fairly young in our sort of network system history, but I come on to the mandate in a few minutes. But I really do believe the PRAC is at the forefront of adopting and driving use of alternative evidence sources beyond the more classical RCT and the initial submissions. Again, what is this famous risk assessment committee? they have a sort of access all area mandate, all aspects of the risk management of the use of medicinal products, and design and evaluation of post-authorization safety studies and pharmacovigilance audit. And what's interesting, in addition, is that I come from an agency that was instituted primarily to deal with all the innovation, in particular with Professor Jean-Hugues Trouvan in the audience, with the biologicals, all the recombinant DNA production. And Europe said, those things are so complicated, we need to keep a track on those, centrally approve them and monitor them. But the PRAC has got an access all areas supervisory authority over all the established actives out there as well. And there's a hell of a lot of them if you think about what's licensed in Europe. So they have to deal with the legacy products as well as all this innovation coming in. And as I'll go on to show, there are many issues with the legacy products that we need to struggle with on literally a daily and monthly basis. Okay. That's essentially the primary objective of the Pharmacovigilance Committee. So it's a proactive investigation of the drug safety using risk management plans, post-authorization studies, and continuous signal detection. The paradigm change has been that even when you're thinking of your development program to get an initial approval, you have to think about evidence generation and gathering post-approval. And that's a sea change in the paradigm of how we do medicines regulation. It certainly didn't just start with the institution of the Pharmacovigilance Committee, because it even predated it by 5 or 10 years, but it certainly matured in its institution. Okay? Driving forward the new era in transparency, real-time access to information on the PRAC activities. I'll illustrate that in a few moments. Increasing involvement of stakeholders in the decision-making, healthcare professionals, patients, and the public. And what's very interesting is that we have healthcare professionals and patient representatives as formal members, voting members of the PRAC committee. And 20 years ago, people would have been, oh, you couldn't possibly have that, it has to be sort of highly qualified doctors, pharmacists, whatever. There was a sort of arrogance, there was a sort of paternalism in the system. And lo and behold, when you involve healthcare professionals and patients in these committees, they have very, very valid points to make. And that's not just a token comment from myself. That's based on real experience right across the operation of the network. I wanted to just highlight very quickly now just a number of cases, because I know my time is closing out. 11 o'clock is still the target though, chairs, yeah? Yeah, give or take. This was something that they did, diclofenac and cardiovascular risk, and it was essentially, what was very interesting about this was that in Europe we did a lot of sort of safety assessments on selective COX-2 inhibitors, and we thought, we restricted these rather heavily, but one of the consequences is that we were moving patients onto non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which are older, predate the COX, and in a sense, do we have as strong an evidence base? Whenever we take action on one class of drugs, do we know what we're moving the patients onto, from out of the frying pan into the fire? And to some extent, one of the byproducts of that review was that diclofenac, one of the non-steroidals, had a somewhat similar risk safety profile with regards to this cardiovascular risk element, which then merited a further restriction and special treatment in Europe. But indeed, I just wanted to show this as an example that using prioritized independent research for best evidence in regulatory action on diclofenac. And there you will indeed find a number of colleagues from the committee and indeed the agency. A somewhat similar effect with domperidone, again with cardiovascular risk, again coming from a very large pharma epidemiology study, confirming an increased risk then of sudden cardiac death in the over 60s. And as a consequence of that investigation, a further commitment to generate additional data on efficacy in children. So, that's another byproduct of doing these referral type procedures. I noticed that you're doing work with addiction centers, etc. This was a rather interesting one because it was methadone containing povidone and renal failure. It was essentially a formulation for methadone administration as treatment of addicts, and essentially what they were doing is they were injecting the the methadone oral solution formulation, because they had high molecular weight PVP, it was falling out, depositing in their renal system, and essentially they were having kidney failure. That was picked up by various pathologists and reports in Norway and led to the suspension of those high molecular weight products. They were not unsafe in normal conditions of use, i.e. if you take the oral solution, no problem, but because of their abuse potential, and we work very closely with the EMC DDA on that, it was thought better, recognizing the reality of the world we live in, suspend those products, get the guys to reformulate, and at least we avoid the harm of well, death and renal issues. In terms of factor VIII products, which is probably something somewhat close to Professor Trouvin's heart, I would imagine, there was a lot of controversy over whether or not there was a difference between recombinant generated or indeed plasma-derived factor VIII products. And here you have something that will go out in the public domain with regards to in the literature, and that can cause an awful lot of anxiety to a very special patient group. We had a look at it, and based on an evidence-based decision, we believe the evidence just isn't there to make such a differentiation. We hope that's a reassuring message. We would have worked very closely with those representatives of the factor VIII patients in delivering that final assessment, etc. But again, you will still have individuals out there, and perfectly fine, that will take issue with these types of findings and say, no, I beg to disagree, I interpret the data this way. But at least we look at an issue, we have a transparent outcome, and we do hope to at least address the patient's concerns. This is one I want to highlight, and I think you have it on this afternoon, but I think it's from the non-clinical perspective for the agenda. Valproate is to some extent always with us. We did a referral in 2014 on it. It's a well-known sort of effect then in pregnancy and women of childbearing potential. We did do a referral in 2014. As a consequence of that referral, we said, guys, we need to have a follow-up to make sure that the restrictions achieve the desired effect. To be fair, ASNM, then the French agency, had a look at that on the French scene, and the conclusion was, it's not having enough effect, let's go back again, let's take it in, have another look at this. One of the reasons I'm highlighting that is not just because that France has initiated that secondary look at it, is the fact that we just had the first public hearing with members of the public on this topic a couple of weeks ago in London, and we had representatives, patient representatives from or even patients, or victims, if you wish to call, from France, from the UK, from Ireland, from all over Europe, that were essentially sharing their concerns with this product with the Pharmacovigilance Committee, and that referral is still running. But what is always very interesting about this, they don't just share the concerns with a view to sort of seeking compensation or liability. They actually want that others are protected from accepting that some of these products have to be used in certain situations. The motivation is protect, better inform the future generations of patients that may have to use these products. And of course, there's a responsibility now on the Pharmacovigilance Committee to react to that input, but it is an interesting evolution in the system. Again, a first for Europe that we didn't have before. And then I want to finish with this one on gadolinium, because again, knowing that you have a somewhat non-clinical perspective on things, this is an interesting situation whereby diagnostic agents, and the agency restricted the use of certain linear gadolinium agents, and the main concern was gadolinium deposition in the brain. And it wasn't that we had evidence of clinical harm. This was more a referral that, based on preclinical data, some autopsy data as well, there was a precautionary principle applied that one series of formulations of diagnostics had a higher risk potential than the other, and essentially the system says, we don't think that's a good long-term risk. And rather than do a sort of clinical trial in patients exposed and wait 20 years for the material data to come out, we think as a system it's better to say limit that exposure now, use the more modern agents that potentially do not have the same deposition challenges. Again, that was been a very controversial outcome. Likely it could still be challenged in a court setting, but it's certainly what the system has said. I just want to finish, and you'll be glad I am finishing 2 slides more, if you forbear. We've talked about the idea that we want to understand what's the novel, what's the innovation in the pipeline. And we've talked about how we want to try to improve our regulatory tools and standards informed by what's coming. And we've talked about trying to understand the data landscape in terms of alternative sources of information that influence regulatory decision making. But again, we're very aware that we do not have the monopoly of the data, in a sense. This is not a black box discussion between the regulated and the regulator. There is a civil society interest in everything that we do, because everything is with that public health objective, and therefore there is a responsibility to try to make the underpinnings of any decision public and transparent and into the public domain. So that's what's said in the strategy. This was a discussion, and if you look at the date on it, around about 2012, 2013, and there really was a debate in Europe. I just put this guy up. It's not because I want to advertise his book. It's Ben Goldacre. He's a UK columnist, a health columnist, and a very doctor by background, and a very knowledgeable sort of observer of the system. And he wrote this book a number of years ago called Bad Pharma. And if you read it, if you're in the pharmaceutical industry and regulators, whatever, it's a disturbing read. There's no doubt about that, because it's a very highly critical. But again, it's not just a criticism. It's also got some solutions identified. And of course, to summarize, part of Dr. Goldacre's proposal, and indeed this All Trials initiative, is a simple thing in science. If you believe in open science, you should have open access to all of the data, positive and negative, and therefore that will inform true evidence-based scientific decision-making. And frankly speaking, as a system, I think we said, yes, we agree with you. We have a slight problem in sort of, we have to convince the industry that we have the legal right to do this. So since then, we've had a sort of a very tough discussion with the pharmaceutical industry. And why just the pharmaceutical industry? Because from their perspective, they generate the data, they own the data. And this is not just a European discussion, this is a global discussion, because you can imagine US interests in particular very strong on this point. But from our perspective, what we said to the industry is, guys, whatever about the quality data, how you formulate, how you sort of compose your formulations, people can understand the Coca-Cola recipe type idea that that's sort of commercially sensitive. When you do tests and trials in humans, the results of those tests and trials, once they're there and once they've been used to achieve their primary purpose, i.e. licensing, in what way should those tests and trials be secret or suppressed? And you might say, well, you get publications from those trials, and that's true, but a publication is 10, 15 pages, whereas what we get in the trials is hundreds, if not thousands of pages of information. So essentially we were saying, once it's been used for its primary purpose, then there is no reason why that shouldn't be then put into the public domain. At the moment, we're partially winning the debate in the sense that we announced that we would open up the clinical data on the new medicines. That was various, October 2016 was essentially our launch date, and we started to put up literally hundreds and hundreds of these clinical studies from the new medicines that we're currently authorizing. Again, I don't want to paint too rosy a picture. We already have a backlog on publication simply because it's a hell of a lot of information to get up there on the internet. But if you do want to visit our website and have a look at it, it's pretty much all there. Limitations on it, we don't have the individual patient data, and some researchers like Cochrane and whatever would really like access to that to essentially do secondary statistical analysis. But in terms of levels of transparency beyond anything we've ever done before, it really is a step change. And the only thing I can say is that we hope that eventually the resources we have behind this will be sufficient such that as soon as we approve a drug, within a very short space of time, you're able to go to the website and essentially see all of the clinical data upon which that drug approval was based. And with that, I will close with the loop. Yes.
So thank you, Tony, for this excellent presentation. Very interesting to see how the EMA is now open to the public, to the regulatory science. One point in terms of introduction for Tony, it's my pleasure to tell the audience that in fact Tony is indeed the head of the scientific committee for regulatory science at EMA. So this may explain also why he speaks so well in terms of regulatory science in the regulatory framework. So thank you, Tony, for this excellent presentation. Very broad and prospective vision of the regulatory science and regulation in terms of medicinal products. Of course, we have only discussed about medicinal products for the moment, but I guess that in the afternoon there will be a place for many other discussion on regulatory science. I have one question before to go to question from the audience. One question, Tony. Since when could you date the initiative from EMEA to go for a more open access to this documentation, to your interest in regulatory science and so on?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'd have to credit it to our new. We had a change of director, a guy called Professor Guido Rassi, and he came in. He was previously head of the Italian agency, but he had also had a lot of exposure to academic sort of clinical trial type work in Italy. And I honestly think that it certainly was his initiative. If you have to credit anybody with bulldozing that policy through, and it needed a bulldozer to get it through, he definitely was the impetus behind. Up to that point, I think everybody had been, and when I say everybody in the system, had been fairly comfortable with essentially saying that all of our assessment reports, etc., once we had approved a product, we would be very happy release them to access to documents, like, you know, under the access to documents type regulation, but that there was a veil of secrecy applied to the initial marketing authorization documents submitted by the company. It was just simply, no, you just don't go there. And it wasn't that we in the agency had that, because every national agency had the same view in Europe, and even every global agency by and large had the same view as well, if you talk with the FDA colleagues. So to some extent, the fact that a public body would generate an assessment report, that would be accessible. Everybody had no problem with that. But I think what people felt was very challenging was this idea of opening up the actual dossier submitted by the company, because whenever they submit it, they always have confidential property of printed on every single page, and it can run to tens of thousands. Having said that, in parallel, I think it was an environmental shift, because also, you know, civil society, European Parliament, they were driving through the clinical trials regulation, and there, as part of that, there is a lot more transparency on clinical trials just around the corner, because, you know, they have to do summaries of the protocol, summary of the outcome, etc. And essentially, this is a dam breaking. And I think, you know, Professor Razzi was aware of that as well in that context. And essentially, one of the arguments he used to industry, guys, you know, this is ridiculous, you know. You already have the volunteer system in the States with the clinicaltrial.gov. You have a very powerful regulation coming down in Europe that demands transparency for the benefit of the patients and the doctors. So, you know, why are you resisting us now on this? And to be fair, you know, to the industry, by and large, most of them got it and moved with it. And our experience, you know, because this takes collaboration with the industry to get this thing up online, because they have to produce a first version of it. By and large, from my colleagues, that is going well. I will have one reservation. We are still not out of legal challenge in this area yet. There is still the possibility that something could go wrong in the legal process. But I honestly think that would be a retrograde step now, and very unfortunate if that happens. But
thank you. Very reassuring to see that one regulatory agency, at least, is now open to regulatory science, and not only to consider application dossier and making judgment on the pharmacovigilance and the efficacy of the product. Any question from the audience?
Yeah, hello, Cécile Michel, working at ANSES. My daily job is more working with ECA than with EMEA. I do have two questions. The first one regards the these data that you make public, I was wondering if they still have economic values within which the data are now public, but when an industry wants to use data from another industry, they have to pay. And I was wondering, for these clinical trials data, I think they have some added value when an industry wants to create a new drug when comparing the efficiency of one with the other. So that's my first question. How does it work? Do the company needs to pay for using those data that will become public? And my second question was regarding these, what you called real-world data, that you said that also it seems like ideal. You still struggle with difficulties of having access to those data. And I was wondering, those data are popping up everywhere on the internet. We have thousands of pages of people complaining about that and that drug. And so is it because they belong to others that you struggle using them? Because anybody of us can have access to them, actually. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. So the first one, no, I mean, if there is no, I mean, the simple answer is there is no charge for anybody to look at or indeed use the data that's online. And basically there's two levels of access. One is read on screen. So basically, and anybody does that, and you do, it's very simple. I invite you to try. And the second one then is indeed for the researchers, because the research community, the academic community, said this is ridiculous. If all we can do is read it online, hundreds and thousands of pages, we can't work with this. We really do need to be able to download it, abstract some of the data, do meta-analysis, this kind of thing. And so there's a secondary option where you can actually download the data and indeed work with it and use it in publications for your own research activities. The only thing you have to do there, I mean, I can't read you the full terms and conditions, is basically, proof of identity in terms of who you are, and also a commitment that you will acknowledge the source of it and not misrepresent it. In other words, falsify the type of data. There's a few other things there, but there is no payment for that. The sort of concept is that we believe that there's enough data protection in the European system such that another company just couldn't do a similar application in our region, at least, and in sort of sophisticated regulatory regions that would allow them to secure a product approval simply copying and pasting that data. So we believe that's not a real concern. It certainly was a concern that was voiced by the industry as a potential misuse of their data, because I mean, and that's our principle. We have other protections in place for patented INNs, etc. And generic companies or even biosimilars, when they come along to compete legitimately 10 years down the road, they don't need to resubmit the clinical data that we've published, because essentially they're doing bioequivalence or biosimilarity assessments. So, I mean, that's our position that we maintain. Of course, if there's another country in the world that all of a sudden would take somebody that was doing a copy of the product and then throwing in the clinical data as a sort of standalone submission, that could not be precluded. We haven't had any evidence of that yet, but I mean that is one potential downside of so much transparency, and certainly the industry did highlight that in the negotiations to get this policy off the ground. But in terms of the balance of interest, even with that concern, we believe the balance of interest favour the full publication now, rather than have that concern sort of override that decision. And then the second question then was on the the real. I know it's well, the real difficulty we have is, in a sense, we've had it too easy to some extent, in that the way the system in Europe has been set up is the duty is on the applicant to gather the information, to put it into the application, and then the regulator sits in the office and assesses what's in the application. The applicant has the duty to include all data, so all negative and positive. That's a legal responsibility. And they also have to do reviews of the scientific literature. But that's it. They don't have to go in, and in fact it would be unfair, because they don't have access to national health records, all of these different databases, and you end up with a lot of sort of ownership issues, because a lot of these registries, be they patient, product, whatever, They're often set up maybe by charitable organizations with some funding, but they do have a commercial aspect behind, and they also have an interchangeability aspect behind. But that's some of the real problems that are being identified. But there is a willingness, even amongst those particularly amongst those groups, to collaborate and try to make sure that the registries can be somehow integrated in a way that can benefit the overall review process. So I won't pretend it's easy by any means, but it's a discussion that goes beyond the pharmaceutical area, very much into the health area. But I don't think people, and you get some individual member states that are particularly good. I think Iceland, for example, smaller population, highly sophisticated electronic records. You get various centers of excellence around Europe that you can actually access this information in a very structured and accessible way. The challenge will be to extend that best practice across the other member states.
Thank you, Tony. I think we have no more time to take any question, and we have to go to the next topic with the tableau.
Very good. Well, thank you, Robert, and thanks to everybody for entertaining this opportunity for me to make this presentation. I really appreciate this opportunity to join this exciting conference. I want to talk to you today about the Global Coalition for Regulatory Science Research and our activities in this area over the last 8 or 9 years. I actually am from the National Center for Toxicological Research. It's one of the 7 centers within the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and we focus on developing data for FDA decision-making and on developing new technologies. But I think this conference certainly points out the global or international nature of regulatory science, and so that's really what I want to speak to you about today. The outline for my presentation includes our definition of regulatory science, also something about the Global Coalition for Regulatory Science Research, which is a combination of individuals from various regulatory agencies around the world, and then also some of the activities that this coalition organizes and supports, including the Global Summits on Regulatory Science, which are an annual conference, as well as working groups within the Global Coalition that focus on bioinformatics, nanotechnology, emerging technologies, and now a new one that focuses on scientific exchange and training. And then a little bit about our future plans. So turning to our definition of regulatory science, and this is promulgated back in 2010 by our Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration at the time, which is Dr. Peggy Hamburg. And the definition is it's a science of developing new tools, standards, and approaches to assess the safety, efficacy, quality, and performance of regulated products. So it's a very broad definition, very much focused on the activities, especially of the Food and Drug Administration. And you can see here that one of the important goals of this was really to bring the new technologies of the 21st century into solving problems that are with us today and looking for tomorrow. And also it was recognized right away that collaborations and partnerships would be necessary, both in terms of interaction with other academic institutions, industry, as well as other government agencies, but doing this not only within the United States, but throughout the world. So one of those kinds of reinforcements for this activity came from the World Health Organization and the Institutes of Medicine, reporting that if for food safety medical products safety needs, that there would be a need for not only a strong national regulatory system, of course with FDA being a portion of that, but also the idea of developing sort of a global curriculum in regulatory science and to outreach and to develop a partnership with countries around the world. So what is the Global Coalition for Regulatory Science Research? It really is an international coalition of regulatory bodies around the world. And the goal is to facilitate and promote the development of regulatory science and especially the research that underpins regulatory science. And we established this global coalition in 2013. So the missions are really to explore those areas of science and research that can be used to advance regulatory science, and this includes both in food technology, medical technology, regulated products, including drugs, and public health in general. And also the idea of doing this in a collaborative way across many countries around the world. It really emphasizes the development of regulatory science internationally, globally, and doing it in such a way that it also helps training and sharing of expertise. So this is what the Global Coalition looks like today. We've built on this from a group of 8 or 9 countries, and now have more than that, including, of course, a very important segment, which is the combination of the EU, which involves the EMA, of course, EFSA, and the JRC. And so certainly France is a part of that organization, and we encourage everyone's participation from the EU group, and also the idea that it's linked into other groups around the world, including, of course, the Japanese with new membership in the Food Safety Conference Group from Japan, as well as Brazil, Australia, New Zealand. China is a new member just this last year. The Chinese FDA joined. Argentina has been an active member from the very beginning, as well as Canada and Singapore. So altogether, there's many nations involved, and we certainly encourage the interaction from your country of France, but also the EU in general. So some of the activities from this global coalition are to organize this annual global summit that I mentioned, and really provide a platform for discussions and communications about regulatory science needs and the future for regulatory science. And also to establish these working groups, of which we have 4 now, that really look at developing new tools that will be useful in regulatory science now and in the future. So some of the conferences that we've helped organize over the years, dating back to 2011, are really focused on this international goal of advancing regulatory science. There we discuss innovative technology as well as collaborative partnerships and anything that can be used to translate the basic science into regulatory application. So the real emphasis is on research that will support regulatory application in the future. And the opportunity here is to use and to study things such as emerging technologies, including nanotechnology, various kinds of omics, including next generation sequencing, bioimaging, etc. And I think that it's really important to realize that we really rely on big scientists and regulators from the various countries to not only develop and to talk about these new methodologies, but to look for opportunities for consensus and use of them around the entire world. So the first conference that was held in 2011 had the theme of regulatory science research and innovation. And we had a number of scientists there from various countries, including those from the base countries of this organization. It was important that we realized at that point in time sort of the definition of regulatory science, and to really use this opportunity to promote the development of regulatory science research. One of the goals of this group is always to publish the outcome from our global annual meetings. And this is one of those examples here. And you can see that Margaret Hamburg, who was the commissioner at the time, was one of the co-authors. The second meeting was held in China in 2012, really looking at modernizing toxicology. And of course, it's co-hosted not only by the FDA, but also Zhejiang University in China. What we have are a number of speakers that address the various issues having to do with regulatory science and expanding those groups involved in this area. And focusing on this, it really is looking at new tools, both in the terms of medical technology and in food safety, and also look for advancing collaborations. And first about the training of scientists in a global way. And since that point in time, there's been many exchanges of scientists from one country to the other, to learn about the technology and types of regulatory research that's going on and to promote that. And really to provide more innovation in the area of regulatory science research. Again, we were able to publish that document, so we summarized the work and explained the utility of this for the future. In 2013, we not only had our global summit, but we were also able to establish this global coalition for regulatory science research. And this was really came about because of the impetus from the FDA commissioner. They helped us send out letters of invitation to 17 countries. And we had our first meeting then, including 19 members of individuals from various countries representing 9 different countries. And at that time, we also followed that up with the Global Summit that focused on nanotechnology. Nanotechnology is one of those areas that has worldwide application and requires a lot of fundamental research to understand how nanomaterials can be regulated in the future. And so this one really looked at the practical presentations about the state of science for nanotechnology, and really emphasizing the need to characterize nanomaterials and to develop standards. And clearly identified areas that could be used for sort of a global consensus on approaches. It was really good that we had this representation from around the entire world. Now, moving on to 2014, the theme there was regulatory genomics and beyond. Really had a chance here to look at bioinformatics and how one uses that tool to especially enhance genomic analysis. This one focused on food safety and medical products with a strong emphasis in food safety, and really looked at the challenges to reach international consensus on genomic analysis. There was a good dialogue on the area of genomic applications for regulatory science, looking at both the technical and logistical challenges and how genomic technologies could be used in the regulatory environment. Again, training needs were identified, and it was thought at that point in time that the greater exchange of scientists from between countries would be important to carry out this aspect of looking at the application of genomics to regulatory science. Again, we were able to publish our work and to describe the activities that were conducted at that two-day global summit. And then in 2015, we moved to Parma, Italy, and this was hosted by EFSA, but there was a large contingent, of course, from individuals from the EU there. We're very thankful to the collaborators there at EFSA to put on this meeting along with the Global Coalition. There, the topic was regulatory bioinformatics, and it really was important to look at this and how bioinformatics can be used in a decision-making process, and also what are the global trends and principles that can be applied to regulatory science when it comes to bioinformatic data sets. And so some of the outcome was really looking at the quality of the data, as well as validation and standardization of various tools that can be used. And so regulatory bioinformatics applications were the key. Here, we were able to challenge, the challenges included the idea of the big data sets, not only how you can collect them, but how you can store them and analyze them and share them, which is oftentimes one of the most difficult things. And so here, the idea of various kinds of computational methods were examined, and those that can be used, of course, on a national and international basis. So again, we were able to publish this work and to get a summary of our conference out there for everyone to take advantage of. Now, this one in 2016 really focused more on nanotechnology again, especially standards and their applications. This one that was held right there in Bethesda, Maryland, close to NIH, really had a good focus on this area of developing standards, and there was a good number of countries there, including good representation from the European Union. Here we really looked at the idea of those stakeholders and where the state-of-the-art nanotechnology science is at this present time, and also the really need for standards and methods development that are so key to developing this area. And it was decided that there would be a way at this meeting to help sort of outline those areas that needed standards the most, and to prioritize standard development and actually cooperate across various countries in developing standards for application in the nanotechnology arena. Again, we're able to publish this work, and along with that, we were able to do an emerging technologies sort of white paper, and this was very important for us to get out there for individuals to be able to examine. And so for 17, not only did we discuss this idea of the regulatory landscape for food and drug safety and the idea of using new technologies, and this meeting has just been concluded. But we also looked at those standards that were needed for reproducibility of studies, and looked at challenges from the opportunity of working across various countries to expand regulatory science. So now I just want to say that we're planned our next meeting will be held in Beijing, China, in September 26, 27 of 2018. Here again, bioinformatics will be a major theme, but it'll be a major sub-theme of dietary supplements and traditional medicines. We think this will be an area that's really important across the world. I know within the United States, there are millions and millions of dollars spent every year on dietary supplements without very much of regulatory control on those. So there's a big question about what sort of regulatory kinds of appraisals should be done on dietary supplements and traditional medicines. And one of the foundations of this group will be to examine the science base of how those kinds of determinations can be made. The organizers will be the National Institute for Food and Drug Control within the CFDA, as well as the Global Coalition Executive Committee. So let me just sort of finish up then by looking at some of the Global Coalition activities. And one of those areas are the various working groups. We have now 4 working groups, and each member of the Global Coalition can be can line up and join one of these working groups, and many our membership on 2 working groups. And these include emerging technologies, which would be everything from microphysiological systems, the use of imaging and preclinical safety assessment, the use of bioinformatics and omics. All these emerging technologies are examined under this kind of format. Of course, bioinformatics is an important one of those areas, and it's getting a lot of play and can be useful in so many different ways when it comes to regulatory science application. And then nanotechnology that we mentioned several times already. The new group is a cross-training group just created this year, and it's off to a good start under the leadership of our Canadian colleagues, Pramal Silva. And there we're really looking at the opportunity to exchange scientists from one country to another, or one regulatory agency to another, to learn new technologies and to exchange ideas and build confidence and collaboration, and also to use that as a base then to build collaborative research projects that can be used across the entire world. So one of those areas that has been a focus is the nanotechnology area, and a white paper was developed under this working group of nanotechnology, and it's an extensive summary of the conference that was held in 2016. And it really outlines what the principles are behind nanotechnology regulation, as well as what standards are necessary, and gives a prioritization of those standards that were agreed upon worldwide that maybe should be developed first, and how to go about that process. So we're really happy with these kinds of outcomes coming from our working groups that sort of lead the way in how nanotechnology and the standards behind nanotechnology will be developed and used in the future. And the same way with our bioinformatics working group, One of the white papers that came out of that working group really focused on food safety and especially the genomic data supporting regulatory science in the area of food safety. This area, as you know, using next generation sequencing and other modern approaches has really taken off in the last 5 or 10 years. And this paper sort of summarizes some of the approaches that can be used and gives definition as to why certain approaches are maybe perhaps superior to others. So finally, I want to turn to the regulatory science cross-training working group that I mentioned. And this vision statement now has been accepted by the Global Coalition and will be put forward as a model on how to foster international capacity building and collaborations through this working group. And here, the scope is really to focus on laboratory support and emerging new science, really to strengthen, the personnel training through established networks, and also to build capacity and promote scientific collaboration. So the idea is to use these exchanges to help build collaborative projects where different aspects of regulatory science could be examined from a research perspective. And so some of the functional planning here involves not only establishing of the working group, and that has been done now, but also the drafting of the terms of reference for this group, as well as holding initial meetings, surveying the opportunities for exchange. That is, many of the regulatory groups around the world already have exchange and training programs. So how can we sort of make a catalog of those and make that available to many? And then also which gaps exist and how can we help fill those from this group? And then, also have the exchange idea of having speakers exchange from various agencies to generate interest, and then, compile sort of a resource identification and interest area. And then, face-to-face meetings in 18, we'll have a chance to really see the progress on this and review our progress. So I just want to close by summarizing some of the accomplishments of the Global Coalition. It really is the idea of building a multi-country collaborative research structure to support regulatory science in a global way. And we've not only formed a sort of a foundation of this and have now over 10 countries and the EU actively involved, but we also have the opportunity to have these working groups, which include bioinformatics, nanotechnology, emerging technologies, and this cross-training, which is the newest group. And we hold these global summits then annually, not only to look at certain aspects of this, but also to build more collaboration, interaction around the world. And future plans include identification of knowledge gaps that may hinder the use of new technologies to really foster collaborative research from around the world, and also to generate these white papers that summarize the areas and sort of point to where new strategies should be developed. And then, of course, to establish and utilize the cross-training working group to build collaborations and training bases worldwide. So with that, I'd like to close and thank all of you for your attention. I really appreciate Marie and Raja for helping with the establishment of this connection, and Robert and the organizing group for the opportunity to present. And I'm very thankful for the opportunity to present this and be happy to try to answer any questions you may have. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Bill, for it was really interesting. And actually, I personally was not really aware of this initiative, and I learned a lot by listening to you. And I don't know how many people in the audience were really aware of that. And I think first, just let me tell you that I wonder how you were able to avoid an endocrine disruptor group. I mean, it seems very surprising.
Well, that's an interesting question, Robert. And as you probably are aware, we are expecting that the outcome of the 2-year assay on BPA, for example, is being conducted at the NCTR, my establishment, and we expect the final report to come out in February, March of 2018. So we're very close to having a big data set that was mentioned by several of the presenters over the last few hours. So yeah, we do have a definite interest in this area, and certainly, you know, one could think about including such a working group. But you probably noticed that most of our emphasis is sort of looking forward to new technologies and new approaches, and that's where we've sort of been focusing to date.
Yeah, that's very clear from your presentation. Actually, let me just to summarize what you know, the some of the conclusions of this conference today, and the definition of regulatory science. That the actual definition you have is a little bit actually much more focused than the definition that we have been maybe using during the day. For example, here, for example, the what influences decision making is part of regulatory science. You know, with the influence of, for example, society or NGOs or lobbies, and how all this concurs to end up with a decision on these very important issue would be also in our belief part of regulatory science. And you seem to be more focused on actually new tools, as you mentioned. So what do you think of that? I mean, of a more general definition of regulatory science.
Oh yeah, that's an excellent question, Robert. And one of the reasons that our focus for this particular group, the Global Coalition, is on the research side, is that there are many other groups that are really working with and advancing more the policy or the regulatory decision side. For example, within our FDA, we have our International Programs Group, which actually has offices in over 12 different countries. And so there's a lot of work there on inspections, on policy and regulatory decision making. And then, of course, the idea that you have various harmonization groups that are worldwide working together on that sort of implementation of new rules and regulations. So our emphasis is more on the research that underpins that policy or regulatory decision, and developing, you know, new technologies that can be useful worldwide to help make those decisions in a better, faster, and perhaps even less expensive way. So really that's where our focus is, because there are many other groups that are working more on the policy and regulatory side.
Yeah, I think that's important also for us, you know, to maybe you know, have maybe a more focused areas, at least in regulatory science, to see where we could go here in France. I'm turning to the audience. Is there any question that you would like to ask in Bill? Yeah, up. Move.
Hello, I'm Pascal Astagno. I'm the coordinator of the program, PRINCEPS program. I'd like to know what's your feeling about the role of the public in regulatory science, specifically a group of patients for, of course, for drugs and medication, and maybe wider the public and the citizen in general.
Yes, thank you for that question. It is important consideration, and you know, I think that one of those areas is reflected by some of the work that's being done by the U.S. FDA, especially in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, CDER, in that the programs to get, you know, post-market information are being built and are stronger and stronger than ever before. One of them is called Sentinel, and it allows information to be gathered about not only, you know, adverse effects, but other effects of medications that are used by the public. So I think gaining more information from the public about the effects of various agents on them and various drugs is really key. And now I think we're seeing some of that same kind of approach being adopted by some of the food regulatory components of FDA as well. Recently, we had our conference. We had various speakers from EFSA talking about this, and it really was striking to me that if we could develop better tools to collect information from the public, that we could both look at not only drug safety, but also food safety, and get a better definition of what is personal health. I think right now we are dealing with looking at when we have adverse effects, but I think it would be complementary to be able to look for personal health and collect that information that could be used both for food regulatory decisions as well as drug regulatory decisions. And of course, it can be used for devices and other things as well.
Yeah, Bill, did you in one of the meetings you talked about big data, I think, if I understand very well. Did you discuss open data and how much data sharing can be done within that large international consortium? Is that something you have discussed?
Well, it isn't anything that we discussed at that meeting, but I agree with you that it seems to be a major trend within the U.S. and I think around the world that more data sharing is being done and recommended. And certainly, this data set that's coming up from the BPA studies at NCTR and FDA, in conjunction, of course, with NIEHS and the National Toxicology Program, that data will be completely shared with everyone. And it already is at that point where some of the data has been made available to the researchers involved. And then the next step will be to review that, and then it will be shared with the general public. And this is, I think, is really important that these large data sets are available so others could do their analysis on the data sets, so you'll have it right down to the individual data points and be able to really utilize that data in a very comprehensive way. So I think the data sharing is something that's definitely on the rise.
Yeah, it is actually in many different areas, and we have this issue almost everywhere. So this is really an important issue. Let me see if there are any other questions in the audience. Okay. I don't see any. So with that, I think we would like to thank you very much. I think this was it was very, actually we understood everything. I think it was very clear, and despite the distance, so it worked extremely well. Thanks for the people here at our university who did, the technical connections, and it worked really fine. So thank you very much, Bill. We hope to see each other sometime, soon. And the next part is where we will listen to the president of our university. So if you want to stay to listen to him, that would be fun. Just we need a few minutes. If you want to stay, you're welcome. If not, thank you very much, and hope to see you soon.
All right. Thank you very much, Robert. And I really appreciate everyone working toward making this connection over 6 time zones. Very nice. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.